Hey, I'm your humble host Dave, and this is Zilog and Moto, the only channel on YouTube that's dedicated to doing in-depth reviews of each and every English language game released for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. Oh wait, hang on, there's a note from my lawyer. Disclaimer, that previous statement has not been verified and could potentially be viewed as false. Also, you still owe us payment from the ALF Okay, that's enough of that. Lawyers, right? Always wanting signatures and depositions and silly things like evidence. And ALF totally deserved it. Anyone who saw that, you know what, I'm going to stop before they send me another note and bill. Ridiculousness aside, if you're a returning viewer, welcome back. And if you're a new visitor to the channel, welcome. This channel is dedicated to the in-depth review of the approximately 1,275 games that make up the 4 libraries I mentioned, and I usually tackle one game in that list per week. Also, when I say every game for those consoles, I mean every game, even when it's a game as interesting as last week's Trivial Pursuit Genus Edition for the Master System, a game that I still maintain was a decent effort from Domark, but clearly it wasn't a title to light up the almighty algorithm. Let's just say I despise success. Anyway, if that sort of in-depth look at all these titles sounds interesting to you, I encourage you to join the fantastic 287 people that have already subscribed so that you'll know when new videos make their way to the channel, and it helps other people know Zilog and Moto exists. Success! Okay, now that that annoying promoting intro is over with, and in my defense, at least I'm not advertising VPN services or styrofoam masquerading as cereal, let's get to the subject of this week's video, which is Championship Pool for the Genesis, as you can see here. I actually took to Twitter a few days ago to promote this video, like I usually do, and I proved why perhaps no one should listen to me, ever, as I made the boneheaded statement that Championship Pool was the only game dedicated to pool that was released for any of the 4 consoles that make up the basis of this channel. Now, I don't know what possessed me to say that, as being a collector, I've got lists of all these games, and I knew that there were other billiards games for the Genesis, with there also being Side Pocket, Minnesota Fat's Pool Legend, aka Side Pocket 2, and if you include Snooker, Jimmy White's Whirlwind Snooker. And again, I had seen all these titles on my list, and the only thing I could come up with was I knew that there wasn't a billiards-related title for the Master System, Sega CD, or 32X, and since I haven't obtained any of those other 3 games yet, maybe it was a bit of out of sight, out of mind. Regardless, I'm certainly not quitting my day job, but I'm choosing to put a positive spin on this, and now I've learned things about the library that I didn't know before. And that's one of the reasons I really like doing this channel, as there's just something new every week. If I had any sense at all, I'd focus on an actual lesson, like not posting unresearched musings on Twitter that expose my ignorance, but I kind of think if people quit doing that, then Twitter would cease to exist, and we can't have that, now can we? Okay, I think I've mocked myself enough for one video. Let's shift the focus to where it should be and play some Championship Pool. Maybe I'll get lucky and it will deserve some mocking as well. But first, let's take a closer look at the package itself. And this is my copy of Championship Pool, and it's in really great shape. I got lucky with this one, as it doesn't appear, at least from the outside, that this copy got very much use over the years. At least, hopefully it's luck and not due to the game not being played due to its sucking, but I guess I'll find that out in a few minutes. But overall, the case is fully intact and there's no outer signs of wear. As far as the front cover goes, I got a few things to point out. I don't specifically dislike the cover, but the design is a bit odd. First, why is the picture so small? Even if they didn't want any of the various graphic elements, like the title, overlapping the picture, it still seems like there's lots of empty black space, especially at the bottom. But even then, they messed that up for the text box for the best game for shooting pool, which, if you notice, isn't even a fluff quote from some magazine, it's literally just them saying that, with no backing whatsoever. I could go on, but design elements aside, I want to point out the dual references to the Billiard Congress of America, both at the top, and with their own logo down below the picture. I'd actually never heard of this so-called BCA, but I looked it up, and apparently they are a legit governing body for all types of billiards in the United States. However, what they're not is a league for pool, at least not anymore. This is where things got confusing for me because the only pool organization I've heard of is the APA, or American Pool Players Association, which I have friends in. The BCA is apparently separate from that, but there is a BCA pool league that was broken off from the BCA in 2004 and is now run by Q Sports International that also runs the APA competitor, the USA Pool League. And if you kept up with any of that, you're better than me. Flipping over to the back, and there's a pretty boring looking rear cover with a lot of text and the game's screenshots shoved down into the lower right hand corner. This is a bit surprising, as most of the time publishers want those screenshots front and center to try to sell the game, but perhaps in the case of Championship Pool, they were trying to de-emphasize the graphics? That's a subject for later in the review, but these 3 screenshots they chose are actually really good quality and do about as good a job as possible at selling the game, so I'm a little surprised at the placement. As far as the text goes, it's fine. Note the tagline, "Now you can shoot real pool at home," at the top, and the 8 balls for bullet points is a nice touch, but not having all that text on a flat background is a mistake, and makes it hard to read. Opening up the package, and the manual and cartridge are in decent shape. The manual itself appears to be on the larger side, and it does contain a lot of information, but the vast majority of the manual is dedicated to all the variations of pool that are included in the game, and the rule breakdowns between them. Seriously, over half the manual is dedicated to either the brief history of pool section, the rules for the different game types, and then finally a blurb at the end advertising the BCA and trying to get players to sign up for the organization, with a $25 fee, of course. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised by this heavy emphasis on game rules, seeing as how the game is effectively a marketing tool of a sporting governing body, and the rules are important, don't get me wrong, but I would have liked to have seen more details in the actual gameplay section, with the designers instead going the let them figure it out route. Okay, that's the package for Championship Pool. Let's get to the game itself and see if I really can shoot real pool at home. Pool is something I've got a specific affinity for, as I grew up with a pool table and played more than my share of 8-ball, 9-ball, and rotation growing up. And I still go out on occasion, get the occasional game in at various local entertainment spots and bowling alleys. In fact, I think I might shoot pool more often than bowl at said alleys. It's certainly cheaper. I wouldn't say I'm good at it, as I certainly lack that consistent touch on long shots that's really needed to be successful, but I've got a decent grasp on the basics of the game, and games with my sons and others are usually competitive. We're not just screwing around. As a result, and I discussed this a bit when I was doing the great volleyball video a few episodes ago, since this is a sport that I genuinely enjoy not just watching on TV, but actually competing in, I'm probably going to be a bit more critical to the ins and outs of this game, just as a natural bias. However, the opposite of that is also true, and if you create a game that's good about a subject matter that I enjoy, I'll probably swing the other way and potentially be biased towards praising it. This is something that I think is inherent to all of us, but at the same time, I'm going to do my best to try to play all that down and try to be as unbiased as possible for the purposes of this review. While on the topic of bias, when I mentioned that incorrect statement about the game that I made earlier, the person to correct me was Genovi, who's helped me out previously with the channel, so shout out to Genovi. Go check out Genovi's Retro Impressions if you haven't already. But in that correction, he also threw in that Championship Pool was the worst of any of the billiards games available for the console. Now, normally I try not to do any research in regards to the critical reception of these games before playing them, so I don't end up with any of that unintended bias in these reviews, but in this case, Genovi's most likely correct, as I could tell within the first 15 minutes of gameplay that I had an absolute dog of a game on my hands. Let me back up for a minute. Championship Pool was released in November of 1993 for the Genesis, Super Nintendo, NES, and Game Boy by Mindscape, aka the Software Toolworks. And yes, that's the same Software Toolworks that released that disappointing port of Star Wars Chess for Sega CD that I reviewed back in episode 122. Being that the game was released in late 1993, the Genesis certainly wasn't a new console at the time, and I would argue at that point that the 16-bit era was just hitting its peak. Due to that, you might expect developer Bitmasters Incorporated to have really come up with a banger of a title, as the Genesis wasn't a new console that no one had ever heard of or developed for before. Sadly, this is not the case. What we got instead is a dull, uninspired, poorly playing effort that I refuse to believe takes up the entire 8 megabits of ROM on the cartridge, and being that, as that line more or less sums up my views on the game, you'd be forgiven for not watching the rest of the video. But just for completeness sake, I'll try to go into more detail as to what went wrong here. When booting up Championship Pool, you're given 4 game modes: Freestyle, Party, Tournament, and Challenge. Freestyle is more or less your practice mode. You can choose from racking the balls in 5 different ways, and then it's basically just you practicing your shots on the table. For some reason, the developers added in 3 other initial rack modes to go along with those 5 setups, but since it's all just practice and there's no actual competition going on, I'm not exactly sure what the point of having those other 3 modes is, other than the fact that they were referenced in the manual, so I guess they had to include them somewhere? That weirdness aside, Freestyle functions exactly as practice mode should, so let's move on. The next mode is Party Mode, and if you guessed that by Party Mode the game means multiplayer, well, give yourself a golden star. Party Mode has 11 different varieties of pool to choose from, with some being for only 2 players, but then the rest supporting up to 8 players, as was mentioned on the rear cover of the box. I like the fact that seemingly all of the many varieties of pool that were explained in the manual are actually available for play, even though Cutthroat, a primarily 3-player variety, seems to have just been mentioned in Freestyle and isn't really playable, which seems like a miss for Party Mode. While Party Mode is certainly functional and does work how you would expect a multiplayer game of pool to work, complete with being able to check out a scoring table in games that support it like Rotation, it feels somewhat bare bones. All players will share one controller by passing it around, and there's no naming of the different players. Everyone is just player 1, player 2, player 3, etc. Again, it is functional, but it's also appearing to do just the absolute bare minimum to support gameplay. I'm going to skip Tournament Mode for a minute and instead go to Challenge Mode. Challenge Mode is as close to a high score mode as Championship Pool gets. In Challenge Mode, you can pick from one of 6 styles of pool to play, and then you're given 3 attempts, or rounds as the game refers to it as, to score points by making shots without missing a shot. When you miss, a round ends and you're awarded points for that round, and the table is reset for the next round to begin. Other than trying to set a personal best score in each of the styles, there's no real point to Challenge Mode, and there's not a high score table that you're trying to enter your name on, so like Freestyle and Party Mode, Challenge Mode is perfectly functional, but I don't know how much time you'll actually spend here unless you're dueling scores with a friend or something. The final game mode is Tournament Mode, and it's the mode that's the heart of the game, unfortunately. The first problem with Tournament Mode is that out of the many pool styles that were included in the game's various other modes, Tournament Mode only allows you to play in 2 types of tournaments, 8-ball and 9-ball. Now granted, in the US, 8 and 9-ball are by far the 2 most popular styles of play from a real-life tournament perspective, so I understand the focus on those 2. But how hard would it be to include some of those other modes? It's not a huge issue because they did get the 2 most popular ones, and other than Rotation or straight pool, I don't think anyone will be clamoring for a speed, 3 or 10-ball tournament. But it does stand out, and it goes back to my earlier view that they don't appear to have done anything they didn't have to. Building on that point are some major issues I have with Tournament Mode. And remember, Tournament Mode is what everyone is here for. The name of the game is Championship Pool, not Freestyle Pool or Party Pool. The setup for Tournament Mode is that you've entered a tournament being held at your local pool hall with 32 participants in a single elimination ladder, meaning that to make it to the actual championship, you have to go through 5 other players first. Each of those matches consists of a best-of-7 competition, meaning that you have to play no less than 4 games against the computer to make it to the next match. Pretty basic tournament stuff, no different than, say, playing an NBA or NHL game in playoff mode. Well, except it is, because in Championship Pool, there's no ability to save your progress in the tournament if you need to take a break, or just simply to not have to replay that round if you lose at some point. No password saves, and definitely no battery backup. You're just screwed unless you have time to play all 6 matches of at least 4 games in a row, and are lucky enough to actually win all of those games and matches. Not being able to continue a previous game is my major complaint about tournament mode, but there's also two other things that really bother me. The first is that the game features a time warp mode, and when the computer is playing his turn, you are unable to see what is occurring. It just happens, and each time you just have to pray that the computer didn't run the table, and you'll actually get a chance to play again. I like the idea of this, and I support having the option to be able to skip the computer's turns, but that's what it should be, an option. Just having your fate be determined by blind dice rolls is pretty lame, and takes away from the competitive feel of the game. The other thing that bothers me about tournament mode is the lack of a difficulty option. And yes, I know, get good, right? Well, I'd be fine with getting good, except for the fact that the other game modes offer 4 difficulty modes, by way of setting how accurate your avatar player is on the table. So clearly they had the ability to have an option for difficulty in tournament mode, as it's available in the other modes. They just decided to be dicks and not put it in tournament mode. Again, the main mode of Championship Pool. Controlling the game isn't too complex, especially when you get used to it, but the way they implemented certain things is curious. Setting up shots is straightforward with using the A and B buttons, with the A button being used to bring up the target and shoot, and the B button being used for fine aim, which you will need to use if you're going to have any success. But then there's the C button, which is used for adjusting the power of your shot by taking you away from the table, allowing you to set your strength, and then putting you back in table view. Oh, and this needs to be done each time you need to change the power of your shot, so get used to that. Then there's putting English on the ball, or masse, which is supported, but is done in a separate menu in the pause menu. You may not use this function much, or ever, so I kind of understand why they did it that way, but it's still a bit unwieldy. Finally, the game supports 2 other views of the table besides overhead, which are toggled via holding down start and directions on the D-pad, and sometimes they're useful for gameplay, but most of the time they'll be too zoomed in to really be helpful, and seem to be more for show than anything else. Even when you get used to the controls and learn to set up shots exactly how you want them, sometimes your player will inexplicably miss shots. This adds a bit of realism to the game. Hell, I don't know how many times in real life that I've thought I had a shot lined up perfectly and just missed it slightly, and I wouldn't mind it so much if it wasn't for the aforementioned lack of a choice in difficulty in tournament mode. In games of 8-ball, usually you can miss 3 shots, which happens pretty frequently, even when you think you have a shot lined up just right, and then the game is over. This, combined with the lack of a save function for when you might get lucky enough to string 4 wins together, is an absolute disaster. They may have tested the game for bugs, but I don't think they tested it for fun. From a graphics and sound perspective, Championship Pool doesn't seem like an 8 megabit game, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm really curious where all that storage went. It didn't go to graphics, as you can probably tell by the video. It looks better than its NES brother, but that's not saying much. I think the thing that impressed me the most graphically was the animation for the coin flip, so that should give you an idea of where we're at. The sound doesn't appear to have gotten much focus either. The few sound effects are fine, but the soundtrack itself is pretty rough. The game features 4 different music tracks, 1 blues, 1 rock, 1 country, and 1 pop, but none are very good, especially to hear repeatedly. And the kicker is, there's no way to turn off the music, so you either have to put up with the mediocre at best soundtrack, or just mute your TV. It's not optimal, to say the least. Championship Pool is a frustrating affair. Fans of pool are just going to throw their controllers and end up going and playing the real thing, and anyone who's not familiar with the game aren't going to be inclined to play it long enough to get an affinity. As a result, I'm giving Championship Pool 1 star, as it is playable and not bug-ridden. I just don't know why you'd want to. For a game that was released in late 1993, this title should have been much higher quality, and instead appears to be just a quick multi-platform cash grab from Mindscape, where they did just enough to satisfy whatever contract they had with the BCA to produce the game. Okay, that was Championship Pool for the Genesis, and all I can say is I really hope Genovi's correct in saying that this is the worst of the pool titles for the console. After playing Championship Pool, I certainly can't imagine Side Pocket being any worse, but I suppose anything's possible. We'll just have to see when the time comes. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's going to be the last game before a 10-episode run of games that are technically series follow-ups from previous videos, so it's the last time for me to pick a game that I want to review for 2 months. Having said that, I think it's time for a platformer. I haven't played one of those for a while, going all the way back to the New Zealand story in episode 125, so I think it's time. It's a game that does have some current cultural significance, because if it wasn't for the movie it was based on, there's a good chance that the current #1 movie in theaters wouldn't exist, much less many other similar movies. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.